As our culture shifts from live shows to live streams, the Chicago Cultural Alliance finds it more important than ever to dive back into our roots, to create a platform that welcomes tough conversations, and to share our cultural stories of resilience. Welcome to Cultural Connections.
In the 1850s, due to famine and economic chaos in China, Chinese came to America during the gold rush. After that, the Chinese were recruited to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Over 20,000 Chinese laborers, which made up 90% of the workforce, worked for completing the Central Pacific portion of the railroad to connect America from east to west. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Chinese were viewed as economic competitors. They faced anti-Chinese riots and racial discrimination, culminating in the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was the only act passed by Congress that targeted one specific ethnic group to bar them from immigrating to the U.S. and deny citizenship to the legal ones already here. This shameful act separated families and contributed to the bachelor makeup of Chinatowns. This unjust law was not repealed until 60 years later, when in 1943, the U.S. needed China to be an ally. In 1944, the War Brides Act allowed the Chinese soldiers to bring their wives, fiancés from China. And in 1965, the Immigration Act allowed families and more Chinese immigrants to enter the country. Then the Chinatowns began to flourish with families, which is the most cherished aspect of the Chinese culture. As from the very beginning of the Chinese arrival in America, anti-Chinese and racial discrimination have followed them ever since. And now with the pandemic, it surfaces again blatantly against Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. Education is a key here. The history and contributions of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans need to be included in the educational system. We are Americans and are part of the American history. Our stories need to be told and shared.
Welcome to Cultural Connections. This is a visual podcast, and the Chicago Cultural Alliance put this together because we really did want to design this as a platform to raise the voices of the Alliance's core members and the core member supporters as well, who we'll get to know more about. And each of these episodes, we'll hear about different cultural perspectives, about topics related to cultural diversity and inclusion and equity. And today we have here Soo Lon Moy, who is of the Chinese American Museum of Chicago. You're on the board of directors as the most recent board president. and we're excited to have you here. Welcome, Soo Lon. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your wonderful kind words and welcome. I'm happy to be here and very honored.
The reason we have you here today, too, is we are so excited to be honoring you today for your time and work as a community leader with the Chicago Cultural Alliance especially, but also with the Chinese American Museum and the Chinese American community in Chicago. And we are very excited to be giving you this award on behalf of the Alliance as Outstanding Community Leader this year. Congratulations.
Thank you, Peter. And that's very nice welcome. I am very happy and honored to receive this award. It is very meaningful to be accepting this on behalf of our museum too.
Every year at our annual gala, which is MOSAIC. Unfortunately, we're not able to have that this year because of COVID, but we give awards to our community to honor them and to show the work that you all do in the communities. And so this year, the core members of the Chicago Cultural Alliance nominated you for this award. And so we're excited to give that to you and to congratulate you on that. And I want to talk a bit about your work and what you've done over the years. And obviously, you work closely with the Chinese American Museum in Chicago and with the Chinatown neighborhood. So I'm curious, how did you end up finding the Chinese American Museum and starting to work there?
That's a very good question, Peter. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah.
Actually, I did not find it. It was one of the founders who found me through the Field Museum.
Okay.
We were docents at one of the exhibition on Qianlong. They received maybe 250 artifacts from China to be exhibited at the Field Museum for the first time. So I began as a docent to train for that. And Chu Mei Ho, who was one of the founders, she asked if I was interested in joining the Chinese American Museum. But really, it's called Chinatown Museum Foundation, which oversees the Chinese American Museum. At that time, there was no museum built yet.
Got it. And so
Yes.
then when was the museum actually built?
Well, when she recruited me, that was in 2004. And so the museum was built in 2005.
2000.
Yes,
Yeah.
with our first exhibition in May.
Excellent. And so you have, how long have you been involved with the board then?
Since then, since
the beginning?
2004,
Since
right? Yeah,
2004,
so
yeah. Right
it's
from-
been a long time, yeah.
Excellent.
And really, I love it. One of the reasons that Chume recruited me because I am a school teacher and I really love history, and I also speak Cantonese.
You used to be a public school teacher.
Yes.
Yes. And so tell me more about your work as a public school teacher, because obviously that relates so much to the work that the museum does on a regular basis too. Education is a big part of the museum. So what drew you to being a teacher and then working with the museum so closely?
Well, that was really kind of a fluke. I really wanted to teach secondary school education. So, but then my friend told me that they were looking for bilingual teachers at the elementary school level. And since I spoke Cantonese and read and write Chinese, and so I went for an interview and I was hired because they had many bilingual children who just came from China who needed the help of a bilingual educator.
Right. Yeah.
So
Excellent.
that's how I got started. And it's really rewarding to be able to share the Chinese culture and celebrate that with the schools and working with the parents and students. It's been really rewarding for over 30 years.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about some of the work that the museum has done with education? Maybe the most recent exhibition and how that involved the public schools in Chicago a little bit?
Well, right now, because of COVID, and schools are just trying to get their act together on remote learning.
Yeah.
And so they really don't have time to do any extracurricular activity like getting on online programs or whatever. But we, because of COVID, we have put our newest exhibition called Attic Treasures 2 online. It's fully online and it's free to the public, and we hope that the students do get to watch that. And we
Excellent.
do some work with the university around here too.
Excellent.
DePaul and UIC, Jane Addams. They come and attend workshops with our conservator or collections manager.
Excellent.
So,
Andrea, right?
yeah. So we really like to give them the behind the scene on our collections.
Yeah.
So by that way, they really learn a lot more.
Yeah. Did you know that I used to be a teacher too?
Oh, yes. Okay.
I used to be
That's
a teacher
wonderful.
myself. Yeah. So I appreciate, a museum setting for education for
Right.
for that sense, and that's something that I've, always grew up with. And I moved away from being a teacher because I wasn't too excited about the, kind of elements of the public school system that I was working in. But notice that museums can really be institutions for education and provide supplemental lessons and curriculum. And like you're saying, the Chinese American Museum does have content online that can be available for students and teachers now, which is a big deal, especially when so many teachers and schools are struggling right now to find ways to engage young people. So I think it's just really powerful and important that museums are recognized in that way as educational resources for teachers.
Yes.
And I'm curious, so much has happened since COVID.
Right.
And so much has changed with museums and at the Chinese American Museum. I'm sure, these online exhibitions are all new to everyone there. I'm curious if there's other things and other programs or things that you're working on that you're excited about at the museum, considering all of the factors that are happening right now.
Well, we just finished an online celebration for the Mid-Autumn Festival. That was really exciting. We had many people who signed up for it, and we work with our partners at the Field Museum, Chicago Park District, and the Nature Conservancy. So we put together a variety of different programs, dances, storytelling, mooncake eating. I'm sure you had that
mooncakes.
before, right? So, and how to make mooncakes and
Oh, really?
lanterns,
Yeah.
So we have done that, and so that's on our website now.
Excellent.
Anyone can access that, and so I think that really helped promote, learning through the online system,
Right.
that we all know, that we all use now.
Obviously, COVID has set a precedent that nobody has experienced with a museum. But the Chinese American Museum has struggled through other experiences too in the past. We know that the Chinese American Museum here in Chicago suffered a fire in 2008. Is that right? And can you tell us a bit about what happened in that experience of how the museum came out of the other end of that? Because that was a pretty challenging time.
It was, Peter. Fire at the museum. That was awful in 2008. So we had this devastating fire which destroyed or damaged almost 80% of our collections at that point. The good thing about that is no one was hurt. No one was in the building at that time, and the volunteers just left for a lunch break. So then the fire started, and good thing the fire department is only like 3 or 4 blocks away from us, and so they came immediately. The firemen did a very smart thing. They put tarp over some of our exhibitions to protect them from the
collections.
water. And so that helped save us some of our collections. And then also to be less damaged.
Mm-hmm.
And so you probably don't know about this, but through CCA,
Mm-hmm.
Chicago Cultural Connections, at
Mm-hmm.
that time,
Mm-hmm.
they rallied up all the communities, um, museums, and Field Museum, History Museum, and many others, who came in immediately with supplies, with their expertise, knowledge, and really showed us how to triage and how to separate the items and dry them and
Mm-hmm.
put them separately in storage.
Mm-hmm.
And it was such a big help because
That's
we really knew nothing about this,
yeah.
how what to do.
Yeah, and a fire in a museum that has such historic collections, it's scary to deal with something like that because you can lose so much history from the community that it is horrible and
Yes.
horrific that you had to go through that. It is. I know the story of the Chicago Cultural Alliance, and at the time was called Cultural Connections because it was a program out of the Field Museum. And that's also why we are calling this podcast Cultural Connections as well, because we want to share with people the origins of the Chicago Cultural Alliance. And we felt like it was a good time during these odd times to go back to our roots of what the Alliance truly is about. And it is about making connections with other people and other cultures. And the work that the Field Museum and other cultural heritage organizations did to help the Chinese American Museum at that time, I'm curious, what other resources or things that they were they able to provide as a part of that?
Well, they came for many weeks,
Yeah.
day after day, to help us sort things out and continue to bring us supplies. And then also at the end of all that, a few months later, we put together a workshop on how to deal with disasters. It was, open to all the museum core members and whoever wanted to attend. So that was a very valuable lesson to be able to gain something from this tragedy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's huge for other museums and cultural centers throughout the city. And to know how to deal with such a tragedy like that is a big part of what the Alliance is about, too. It's about sharing and networking and sharing resources and ideas. It's really amazing how all of these cultural centers in Chicago were able to come together and support their fellow colleagues through a difficult time.
I think everyone really feel the hurt, that something, even though it happened to someone else, but they can sympathize and feel empathy for all of us. The National Museum of Mexican Art, they hosted a fundraiser for us
Oh, wow.
to make some money to help us with our loss, which
Yeah.
was really
That's amazing.
fabulous. Yes.
I did not know that.
Yes.
And how long did it take then for the museum to reopen after the fire?
It took us 2 years to rebuild. But I just want to mention to you, it's something very unique or strange. On our third floor, where our storage was, there was where the fire was, and so it burned up all the things that were on the third floor that were stored there. We were trying to organize it, fix it up so we could move the artifacts out to storage so the third floor could be renovated. But that's when the fire happened. And miraculously, we found two items that survived the fire. One was a Chinese altar, a wooden Chinese altar, and the other one was Chinese goddess of Gunyang and a child, and they had some smoke damage to it, but
they both survived the
That's
fire.
beautiful.
That,
Yeah, how
yeah, that
beautiful
was
is it? Just
really,
very symbolic
yes,
of those two items surviving
yes,
that.
it is. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was a miracle.
That's a miracle. It's a beautiful story. No, it is. And
Yes.
so now today, the Chinese American Museum of Chicago is struggling through other things. As we all are struggling through, the recent changes that we've all had to make in our lives because of COVID. I'm curious, how has that affected the museum today? What challenges are you facing there?
Now, because due to COVID, we were closed for many months before we were able to reopen. But Chinatown, that's where we're located, had really actually start suffering at the beginning of the year when COVID became known around the world. And so people start shunning Chinatown because there were discussions of Chinese virus and kung flu and all that other rhetoric, and so made people scare, and they did not come to Chinatown. So basically, Chinatown itself, it impacted them a lot more than other businesses and neighborhoods. And so we were really lucky that some of the foundations, they have changed their focus on granting. So, they develop more into like emergency and operation focus, which really helped many of our
Yeah.
cultural and arts organization, and we really needed them
Yeah.
at this point.
That was
And-
huge for the Alliance. It was huge for our 40 cultural heritage centers throughout the city that we work with and serve. Many foundations throughout the city did step up and started to provide relief funding to
Yes.
allow for organizations to continue to operate.
That was a big help,
Yeah.
and also with the federal and local governments and state government, they have implemented loans or programs and to help the small businesses.
Right, yes, the Small
Yes.
Business Association also had the payment protection loan and an economic disaster loan that allowed organizations to nonprofits especially and museums to apply and get that funding, which was huge. And I don't think many of the organizations that we know here in Chicago would have been able to survive without that relief funding. Honestly, there's that was a huge support. But I wanna go back a little bit to Chinatown and some of the really unfortunate racism that was happening there because of it. This started long before we went into quarantine, right? This was Chinatown specifically in Chicago was suffering, and Chinatowns throughout, not just Chicago, but throughout the United States, were suffering because of discrimination. And, that I'm sure impacted the businesses there in Chinatown, but also impacted the museum. I'm curious how the community responded to all of that and how the businesses are taking that right now and adjusting.
Chicago's Chinatown is one of the Chinatown that's growing rather than dying or declining like some of the other Chinatowns all over the United States. And so, I talked to some restaurateurs, and they said businesses are down like at least 80%.
Wow.
And so they try to maintain some of their staff and to cope with, the business loss. And so eventually, most of them did close because you cannot sustain that. And so now with the stimulus fund and all the other grants and loans that came about, they have reopened slowly, And so I'm happy to report that there are actually 2 new restaurants that's open in Chinatown.
Oh, exciting.
And then also a market called 88 Marketplace, which is a few minutes from Chinatown.
Yeah.
And that has open, grand opening. So things are picking up a little bit
Slowly.
more. And
Yeah.
so people very optimistic now.
That's good.
Yes.
Yeah,
And so,
and you know, it's an important message to share that, you know, the words that were used by you know, some people that were discriminatory against Chinese Americans was just awful. The impact that it had on the community long before, you know, everybody else, other businesses were suffering and other organizations were suffering. Chinatown was suffering long before that. And to hear the stories that you're sharing now of the businesses that are opening and the resilience in the community is wonderful to hear.
Yes.
And I do really hope that more people get to know that Chinatown is open for business, right?
Right.
The museum is open, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And all of us take, the safety measures very seriously, and make sure that that you're practicing mask, wearing masks, and also we even take temperature of visitors that come in.
We talked a lot about that in the beginning of all of this when we were thinking about, you know, museums and cultural centers reopening, how people would respond going to these cultural centers and these museums. And how have you experienced that then? People are positive and excited to be back in the museum, I'm sure.
Yes, of course. The numbers are still fairly low, but which really helps us also in monitoring, keeping the social distance. And so we did have a small group that that were divided into 2 smaller groups. So one on the first floor gallery and one on the second floor gallery, and that worked out perfectly. And so also we have gotten safety measure like masks and some supplies, hand sanitizers from the city and from the Census Bureau.
Oh, excellent.
Yes, and so we are also promoting that also, making sure that everyone is aware that to sign up for the census,
Yeah, that's important.
and to get out the vote also. That's very important for
Yeah.
elections.
Yeah, and a little bit about that. You know, the museum, the Chinese American Museum of Chicago, is much more than just a museum, right? That's in its name, but it does promote a lot of civic engagement as well as a community center and a place for gathering for the Chinatown community, but also for all of Chicago. And how important is that to the museum to be civically engaged and working on the census and promoting voting?
I think it's very important. It goes along with learning about the Chinese American history and culture, and all this is all part of American history. All of us should participate in elections and be counted as part of the census. Right now, the Chinese Americans, we really don't have our history and contributions, noted in our history books.
Yeah.
I think it's very important that that the American curriculum, grammar school, elementary school, and high school, and even college should cover the Chinese American history, also other Asian
Right.
culture and Americans, to make sure that all of our contribution and history and stories are told.
Yeah.
So
and
that's very important.
I'm glad you
to
brought
us.
that up because the Alliance, we were approached by the Japanese American Service Committee, who is working collectively with Chinese American Museum and other Asian American organizations like the Filipino Historical Society and the Hana Center, which is a Korean American center, to promote legislation to the state on including Asian American history in public school curriculum. It's shocking to me that it wasn't there in the first place, but we know that, as a former history teacher too.
Right.
It was some of the stuff that bothered me when I was going through my training as a teacher and teaching history. The public school curriculum doesn't include the history that I wanted to tell. That's important. It's a little dry on whose stories are included. I think it's extremely important for organizations like yours and the other members of the Alliance to promote the fact that these stories, Asian American stories, are part of the American history dialogue, are a part of that, and it needs to be taught in schools. And I'm sure you can appreciate that as a former teacher as well, how important that is.
That's why we always include the Chinese culture and history as part of our bilingual curriculum. And so make sure that the kids feel proud of their heritage.
Yeah,
And
Chinese immigrants came to Chicago in the 1870s. Is
Yes.
that right? There's a long history of Chinese Americans here in Chicago. That story needs to be told, and I'm glad that the Chinese American Museum is doing that, sharing those stories, and the Chicago Cultural Alliance wants to support that in so many ways as we can too. I did want to mention that the Alliance is partnering with an organization called Random Acts of Defiance for API. Individuals, and the acronym is called RAAD. And API is Asian Pacific Islanders, right? And it's a collective of scholars and artists who are combating racism against Asian Americans. So everything that we discussed earlier about the racism in Chinatown, this group is really making sure that the Asian and Pacific Islander stories are told and that racism is just out of the equation in this. And so the Alliance is promoting that as much as we can because we want to ensure that those stories are told and that it's not excluded from the history narrative. So I think it's just so important. And the work that you do at the museum and the work that you've done individually as a teacher and educator. And most of your work with the museum has been volunteer, has it not? Yeah.
Yes, all volunteer.
All volunteer, yes.
Right. And so, I just want to also mention that we're part of the member of the what we call CBCAC, which is a coalition for a better Chinese community. It's an organization in Chinatown that advocates, civic engagement and so they've been very instrumental in getting involved with the census taking and also the election, and so that's very very important that we're involved in as part of that organization.
Right. I think, personally, and one of the things that the Alliance hopes to promote more is how important museums and cultural centers in Chicago's neighborhoods are to the communities. They're pillars. So the Chinese American Museum is a pillar of the Chinatown community, and it keeps the history alive of Chinatown. But not just the history, the museum is actively engaged with the community today. And honestly, I found it so impressive during these times, during COVID, when so many places were closing their doors and, just deciding that they can't operate because of so many challenges. the museum still worked towards opening its doors and inviting community in and supporting the Chinatown community when it needed it most, when it needs it most right now. And that's beautiful that a museum
Yes.
can offer that. And not many organizations are able to offer that. So thank you to the
Yeah.
Chinese American Museum of Chicago for giving a voice and a space to Chinese Americans in Chicago, and also to share the stories that are important to this city. So I am amazed constantly by all the beautiful work that comes from the museum. And I thank you for taking the time to chat with us today a little bit
Yeah.
more about it.
Thank you, Peter. And I just want to also mention that, Chinatown is has many different organizations that help us and support us through this crisis. And so you can't do everything by yourself.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're just the helping hand.
Yeah.
But the main work that's done by our organizations in Chinatown, they have really been instrumental.
In the nonprofit world, working together collectively, there is, they call it collective impact. It's about
Right.
making change in your community. And it's not just from the arts sector, which is where the museum is, but it's also from the, government and from the transportation agencies you work together as a community to solve all of the challenges of your neighborhood. And Chinatown could not be a better example of that in Chicago, of a community that supports one another the way that the museum does and the other organizations in that neighborhood do. So thank you so much, Soo Lon, for taking the time to meet with us. We love having you here, and obviously congratulations.
Thank you.
On your award for being outstanding community leader. You've done so much amazing work over the years, and we are so excited to honor you in that way, and to give you a chance to talk about the museum.